9 weeks from the Brexit deadline, a significant move was taken last week. The newly elected Prime Minister Boris Johnson sent a request to suspend the UK's Parliament till October 14th, which was approved later by the British Queen. That will leave less than 3 weeks for opposition parties to enable counter-hard-Brexit measures. The decision soon caused nationwide protests in multiple cities. Are we getting close to the ending of this 3-year-long process? What will be the efforts from opposition parties to stop a no-deal Brexit? And how will Prime Minister Johnson's recent decision to reshape the definition of Western democracy? To discuss these issues more, I'm very happy to be joined in Beijing studio by Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department of European Studies at China Institute of International Studies, and William Spears, Chairman of Spearhead China Limited. Via satellite, we shall also speak to Professor Tom Brooks, Dean and Chair in Law and Government at Durham University. He is sitting in Durham. And Mr. Fraser Cameron, Director of the EU Asia Centre in Brussels. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to Dialogue. First of all, how serious are the protests that broke out in multiple cities in Britain as a result of the recent decision by Prime Minister Johnson to suspend the Parliament?
An interesting question, because of course it is quite serious. On the other hand, it has happened before. The Remainers have so much they think to lose, and the Brexiteers they think have so much to gain. And in reality, these protests are normal in the UK.
Mm-hmm. So, Hongjian, how serious is the reality on the ground about this decision?
I think another very big issue is how could, just like you mentioned at the beginning, is we find out the real definition of the democracy. Because as we know, now the decision by Mr. Johnson, it's in the law, but it could be in the spirit of the democracy, because which means it will, keep the Parliament out of the decision-making process of the Brexit. So I think now the big problem is how could the British people and the politics to find out a real place for democracy between the referendum, the power from the government, and also the legitimacy from the Parliament.
Thank you very much. We have two guest speakers standing by in England and Brussels. First of all, let me go to Professor Tom Brooks. Hi. Previously, Iron Lady Margaret Thatcher was facing opposition from within the party. So Geoffrey Howe, for example, was the first to stand up and say no to her, and that led to the ouster of this former Prime Minister. And then Theresa May also faced similar opposition from her own party. This time around, my question, Professor Brooks, is Prime Minister Johnson facing mutiny from within? And should that be the case, what's the chance for this plan to be reversed, since he also got very strong demonstrations in the streets?
Well, first I'll say the demonstrations have been something close to unprecedented. I was here during the March Against Iraq. I was in the March Against Iraq, and I was here over the last few days. And I've never seen, anything like this spring out, not just in London, but across the country. So this is kind of an unusual situation. I think that the mutiny that Boris Johnson is facing is mutiny, and he's going to extreme measures. He's threatening anyone who votes against him this week, anyone who does anything to stop a no-deal Brexit from the Tory side. He will end their political careers, at least as a Conservative member of Parliament. Something that was apparently once threatened by John Major about a quarter of a century ago, but something more extreme than any modern political leader in this country has ever thought to do before. And why? Because he's in a coalition of sorts, in a pact with the DUP, and with the DUP, he only has a majority of one. This is a desperate man who's doing a desperate measure. He knows that he is really running roughshod over the Constitution, and the only way he's got a chance of trying to hold his troops together and keep everyone on board is to threaten them with their own future political careers. So I think he is facing a substantial fight back, and it could well engulf him very quickly.
Fraser, this new Prime Minister is determined to go ahead with a plan for no-deal Brexit, hard Brexit. So what is the immediate response from Brussels, particularly with regard to the recent decision to suspend the British Parliament?
Well, they're watching it here in Brussels with some bemusement. They're certainly not going to interfere in the internal politics of the UK. But essentially, they are wanting to see what are the chances of Boris Johnson or anyone getting some agreement through the Parliament. Because ultimately, you have to get an agreement, assuming we get to a deal, and that's questionable, through the British Parliament. And at the moment, Parliament is opposed to so many things, but has not shown itself capable of actually supporting any one course of action.
What about the timing, Mr. Spears? The suspension of British Parliament will land on October the 13th, just 2.5 weeks before the end of October deadline.
Well, it was really interesting. Professor Brooks mentioned proroguing about 25 years ago. Now that happened to be by John Major, who is now campaigning against the latest prorogue. So in reality, what I'm going to say is that timing is critical. We must remember that the Parliament itself said that it should be in the hands of the people, the decision. We must also remember, from my particular point of view, that Hammond, who was the Chancellor, has always had a Remain agenda and is making things very, very difficult because people never show their true colours. Now, if people had showed their true colours, we wouldn't have this problem. We've had 3 years now of non-domestic issues in Parliament, all about Brexit, which is a total farce. We need to look after the country and the people of the country. The sooner we get it over, the better.
How likely will the 3-year marathon process be put to an end?
If we look at the situation when Mr. Johnson to win his rivals in the Conservative Party, and we can find that he knows something more, I think, about the feeling, about the sense of the average people about the Brexit. I think now most of the supporters to Mr. Johnson, some of them, yes, from the hard Brexit campus, but some other, maybe they don't care where we should go in a hard Brexit or soft one. We just try to end it as quick as possible. So I think he got something from those people, and so he find the deadline of the end of October to say, okay, we should finish this process. So I think now the question is just like the guest mentioned that I think there will be a strategy for Mr. Johnson to deal with the Brexit issue. Is firstly to give a clear, deadline and the ending of the process, and to get major support from the people. At the same time, once it failed, okay, so it should go to the way of the snap election. At that time, still, because comparing with opposition party like the Labour Party or some other, I think still the Conservative Party led by Mr. Johnson will also win some advantage once his election. So I think he is good. He did a good job to know something more from the average people. And of course, now another very important thing is for Mr. Johnson and his team, they did a good job on how to say popularize their thoughts and their ideas, just like what happened before the referendum 3 years ago.
Professor Tom Brooks, I'd like to have your thoughts on not only someone who's lurking behind Mr. Boris Johnson, but someone far above, Her Excellency Queen Elizabeth II. What do you think of the symbolic token, the token gesture, the approval that she granted so that the Parliament could be effectively suspended? Not many outside the UK have a clear idea about the importance of having this royal constitutional monarchy.
Well, Proroguing, suspending, in simple English, suspending Parliament is something that lots of Prime Ministers have done. It's effectively a kind of break between one session of Parliament and another, and it's nothing unusual. It's a matter of days, though, whether it's John Major or other people, and it's not several weeks up to suspending Parliament for a month, which is what we're seeing now. So I think the thought that proroguing has happened before is true, but it is untrue that there's been anything like this, certainly nothing like this in Queen Elizabeth II's reign. She has a very important function in terms of she gets advice from her ministers, and she acts on that advice, which in practice means she often does what she is asked for. We don't always know what is said in these meetings. They're confidential, but I think she had no choice but to accept the request by Prime Minister Johnson to suspend Parliament. The problem here, I think, is in doing something so very unusual and potentially unlawful. This is a matter in the courts right now, of proroguing, suspending Parliament for so long, that the Prime Minister has done something, I think, unconstitutional, which has dragged our Queen into a political partisan debate. Now you've got protests outside Buckingham Palace, not just against 10 Downing Street. And I think that is something that has been kind of very unfortunate about all this stuff. Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson, no doubt, have plans and thoughts and other things, but they're also two guys who know a lot more about what they don't like than what they do like. Dominic Cummings led a campaign to stop an assembly in the Northeast. He was against the euro. He's against the European Union. But what's he for? It's not quite clear that there is a vision for what the Brexit deal is. All Prime Minister Johnson has done is added kind of red lines to what negotiations, what form they might take with the EU, and not anything particularly positive or new, which is why the muddle, the problem the country is in, is no better now than it was before, even if there is a greater sense of urgency.
Fraser, the Queen's mandate in his hand, but it doesn't mean necessarily that Prime Minister Boris Johnson will move ahead without meeting any obstacles or serious opposition. For example, many of his critics are suggesting seriously that they're going to have a no confidence vote ahead of September the 10th, and they view this as the only chance to prevent no-deal Brexit. What do you think of the prospects in this direction?
It's very difficult to say because Boris Johnson has no real fixed position. Boris Johnson at heart is a pro-European. He always has been. He basically used this issue to further his own political career, and very successfully. But he knows that a bad deal, a no deal, is going to be disastrous for the UK as well, and he's hoping at the very end there will be some kind of change. And let's not forget, whatever happens on the 31st of October, it's not over. That's just the beginning. You're going to have 5, 10, 15 years of constant negotiation with the EU about all kinds of issues, you know, from fisheries to industrial standards to the environment, you name it. Britain is inextricably tied to the European Union, and these negotiations will run for years and years and years.
Thank you very much. William, to put it in a more serious way, many don't think Mr. Boris Johnson has been elected into office of number 10 of Downing Street. He's kind of handpicked internally. What about the chance of having a general election to decide his political fate?
Well, there are two issues here, as far as I'm concerned. One, it is not the first time it's happened before. We had George Brown had the similar process when he was made Prime Minister. If we have a general election, perhaps it's a good thing. Perhaps we will find out the Conservatives or the Brexit Party gets in, and the people will say, OK, let's go for Brexit. The other alternative, of course, is to people have a Prime Minister like Corbyn, which is fine if they like that sort of thing, but my goodness, it would change democracy forever. So it's up for grabs for anyone, really, but I think the sooner we have a resolve to this problem, the better. Whether a general election, get out of Europe, stay in Europe, whatever it may be, get a deal, we just need resolve.
Thank you so much. Whether we're going to have a no-confidence vote or a general election to decide and seal the political fortune of Mr. Boris Johnson, We'll take a second look after this short break. We have more questions on the future of no-deal Brexit. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Let me go to Fraser. Fraser, despite the tempestuous waves inside the US, the EU seems much calmer. The EU has so far not sent out any clear message to reset the 31st October deadline. In such an atmosphere, do you think an agreement could be reached at the last minute, or will it end up with Boris Johnson delivering his promise of leaving? Fraser.
Well, at the moment, the EU 27 countries are totally united in terms of saying the withdrawal agreement that was negotiated with the UK government is what's on the table, and there's not going to be any changes. And I think that will stick because, firstly, they're not going to throw Ireland under a bus. Ireland will stay as a member state of the European Union. Britain wants to leave and become a third country, so you're not going to treat the third country better than a member state. Secondly, in terms of the political room for manoeuvre, there is some room in terms of the political declaration that accompanies the withdrawal agreement, where you can write various options into the future, which will also touch on the backstop. So there is some wiggle room there, but not for the actual withdrawal agreement. That will not be changed.
Thank you so much. Professor Brooks, what do you think of the issue of Ireland?
Well, I used to live in the Republic of Ireland before I came to the UK, and during the referendum I warned anyone willing to listen that the Northern Irish border was going to be a major issue for a great number of reasons. One of them was that Boris Johnson, leading the Vote Leave campaign, arguing about having more strict border controls and doing things differently from the EU, was going to undermine having an open border. You can't be for more restrictions, yet have an open border along your only land border that your country has, and that this was going to become a massive headache for Vote Leave if they were able to be successful. And at the time these things were dismissed. They thought, well, hadn't, I guess, thought much of Northern Ireland, but now it's really kind of blown up. I think it is a massive problem for the Prime Minister, to be fair. You know, how to organize freedom of movement and services across a border, but without being part of a freedom of movement arrangement in the EU. I think it will, if he's able to solve some problem with the backstop, and I'm not quite clear you can. You hear things about technology that could potentially work along the motorway from Dublin to Belfast, but it's not clear it would work on many of the other roads that I've driven. I don't know if the other people in Johnson's government have been around Ireland as much as I have. Will work in those kind of more rural communities. But even if you could do that, I think it will cause some problems, not just for movement between Ireland and the UK. It will cause problems among the common travel area, which seems very few people know much about how that works, but it's an area around certain territories around the UK. I think that's going to be something that will be a real problem. And of course, there's also some wider issues about how Britain connects with other European neighbours. So Ireland might be a small country geographically and in terms of its population, but politically it is a real challenge for Boris Johnson. And remember, his party is the Conservative and Unionist party, but it's difficult seeing the Union standing together if there's to be some type of a different arrangement in Northern Ireland, which I don't know how he's going to get out of this anytime soon.
Thank you, Professor Tom Brooks and Fraser Cameron, for being with us. Mr. Spears, Michael Barnier, the EU's chief Brexit negotiator, said the backstop intended to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland was the maximum flexibility the EU could offer. Do you think the deadlock on Irish border issue can be broken?
Well, the backstop was really put in so we would never leave the European Union, because there's going to be very, very difficult getting that, as Professor Brooks said, very difficult getting that system into place. But it will happen. Technology is advancing very, very quickly. Michael Barnier, what you must remember is the UK has, let's say, a commitment to give 39 billion pounds or euros to Europe if there's a satisfactory agreement. Now, if there is a satisfactory agreement, that's fine. But if there's no satisfactory agreement, that means that the European Union doesn't get the money it thinks it's going to get. So at the moment, because Michael Barnier thinks that the political situation in Europe means that, or in the UK, means that the rebellious MPs will stop a no deal, he's not going to change at all. So we're in that precarious situation where people are standing and puffing their chests out and endeavouring to make it work for themselves, not for the benefit of the people.
Hung Jian, from day one, President Trump, or even when he was the candidate for the campaign on behalf of Republicans, has been very consistently supportive of the Brexit campaign. Now, Mr. Boris Johnson is likely to rally Donald Trump behind him in pushing for the no-deal Brexit. Having said this, in the wake of the G7 summit in France, what do you think of the prospect for Britain and the United States to reach an agreement on tariffs? Similar demands have been raised by President Trump for other allies in continental Europe. And second question, Hung Jian, if you may, what does that mean if both sides fail to reach an easy agreement on tariffs for the economic performance of the UK?
Mm-hmm. Now I think there will be a very complicated trilateral relations between, European Union and the UK after Brexit, and also United States. And even now, I think because of the Brexit, especially Mr. Johnson tried to practice its hard Brexit process. So now there are more requirements from the British side towards United States. But because as you know now, United States is the second biggest trade partner after the European Union with Britain. So now once Mr. Johnson tried to give some more encouragement to the British people, he should say that okay, we are okay. Once we leave from European Union, we can get a closer economic and trade relations with the United States and some other economies in the world. But now I think the question is, just like also some senior official in UK mentioned, was reminded that Mr. Trump and the United States will not be easy to negotiate with any kind of agreement with the UK. Especially now Mr. Trump is practicing this kind of the American first. So what does it mean of the American first in the negotiation with the UK? Another, I think, a very big issue is, and because as we know, there is a very, very bad reputation about Mr. Trump in UK. For the average people, in media, in public opinion. So I think that's also the reason why Mr. Johnson should keep a distance from Mr. Trump when he and his government try to get assistance from the United States. Of course, at the same time, I think that even once there will be an easy negotiation for this trade issue and some other economic issue between UK and the United States, certainly there will be some other requirement, there are other requests from the United States towards UK, just like what happened recently in Iran, in some other security, and also even in the framework of NATO. So it will not be an easy business always for Mr. Johnson and his government when he want to engage with the United States.
William, Mr. Boris Johnson said during the G7 summit that was just concluded in France that he's a fan of a trade peace, not trade war. That certainly stirs the pot with President Trump. It shows clearly that the UK government keeps a distance from the staunch position of the Trump administration about having this trade conflict with the PRC. What do you think of the relationship between the three sides, China, US, and the UK?
Well, President Trump is a very unusual president, I must say that, from day one. He's very gung-ho, he's very Mr. Trump's always right. We have Boris Johnson, who's come into this situation being Prime Minister in an unusual way, like Theresa May did in actual fact. And he's got his own thing. He believes in trade. Without trade, the world falls apart. The world is now becoming very global. UK is really close to China, in as much that maybe not sort of politically, if you wish, but at the same time, trade-wise, we believe that countries should look after their own interests, which we're trying to do as well in the UK, without interference. So this situation of Europe sort of trying to impose itself on the UK is not something that we as a nation really enjoy. So with regard to the situation of trade, Boris Johnson, Xi Jinping and President Trump, I do hope they rise above this crazy political situation, because it's all about beating their chests and being proud of what they're able to deliver. In reality, we need to live together in peace and trade together well.
In theory, a post-Brexit UK will have to maintain steady relationship with the PRC, if not the golden era, since the years of David Cameron. However, the British government did say something that has upset the Chinese authorities on the issue of Hong Kong. What do you think of, a healthy development of the bilateral relationship between London and Beijing?
Mm-hmm. I think indeed for both sides, no matter what happens for the Brexit and which government will be on the stage, I think from British side, it's very necessary to go back to the principles and commitments between two governments. Several years ago, between Prime Minister Cameron and President Xi, because I think this so-called golden era for both two countries will be a long-term strategy and a long-term development. And secondly, I think it's very important for British side to understand you could not try to make money from China and make any benefits in the relations, economic and trade with China. And at the same time, you do something wrong in political, diplomatic and security field. I think it's difficult for China to accept this kind of logic, say that you got money from China and then you do something wrong with China in some other fields. The third is, I think, for UK, I think it's a good time to find its own interests, to find its own, independent position, especially when it faces pressure from the United States. For example, I think recently, what's the attitude from the British government towards this 5G market access?
That's indeed a test of a healthy bilateral relationship between London and Beijing. Yes, indeed, the two sides will have to, particularly Prime Minister Johnson, will have to consider carefully how to deliver a package of issues that might be agreed upon between Beijing and the UK, with a special regard to Hong Kong. That's a test of his leadership, his vision, and of course the resilience of this bilateral relationship between the UK and China. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue with Mr. William Spears, Mr. Cui Hongjian, and two other guest speakers in Europe. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.